Hi, everybody. Welcome back to My Front Porch. I'm Christina. Today, before I get started in the reading of the next two chapters of the timeless love story of Richard and Paulette, I'd like to ask my audience that are following to extend a special thought or prayer today, whatever your preference, for my aunt and my uncle. My uncle is going to undergo a exploratory surgery this week to determine whether or not he may have lung cancer. And so we're very concerned about that prospect at this moment because, of course, he is her primary caretaker. So if you would just keep this family in mind this week, I would greatly appreciate it. And now we'll begin. The commitment. When Richard received the call at Bellevue Baptist and heard of his wife's accident, his worst thought was that she'd broken her arm or leg. There was no additional detail, but he made enough haste to Regional 1 Health Medical Center approximately 18 miles away. At the scene, bewildered bystanders moved Paulette from the sidewalk to the front of the convenience store until an ambulance arrived. Clearly injured in multiple areas, she lay unconscious with serious head trauma, but she was alive. Upon her arrival at the Med, as it's called, she immediately became the top priority patient, so severe was her condition. As Richard arrived, Paulette had already been taken in for major surgery due to swelling on her brain. While he waited, unnerved and in shock, he prayed, "Lord, she's in your hands. She's your child. She belongs to you more than she does to me." After surviving all that had come before, how could she survive this? 7.5 hours later, surgeons informed the family that due to a blood clot pressing on her skull, they were forced to remove a plate of it, which they would store to be reinserted later. Additionally, at least 10% of her lower temporal lobe was removed due to damage beyond repair. The temporal lobe is responsible for long-term memory, language comprehension, and naming and identifying objects. The prognosis? She would most likely remain in a vegetative state, if she survived, for the rest of her life. In recovery, Paulette looked to be the patient of Dr. Frankenstein. She was on a ventilator, and so many machines lined the room that you could hardly navigate around it. She had bolts holding her skull in place, and her brain continued to bleed. There is something called the Glasgow Coma Scale. In essence, the scale is used to measure the brain activity of a patient after head trauma or recovering from a coma by using a point system in 3 categories: eye-opening response, verbal response, and motor response. Patients are assessed as having severe, moderate, or mild brain injury based on a 15-point scale. Anything less than an 8 is considered severe. Doctors told Richard and Paulette that Paulette was a 4 going down to a 3. There wasn't much encouragement. Her prior illnesses had prompted Paulette to sign a DNR, do not resuscitate, in the event of her untimely death. But despite all of her injuries, including a broken collarbone, cracked pelvis, and a broken little toe, Paulette was not on life support, and so the DNR was never activated. So she lay, and Richard prayed, and the family anguished. But no one knew what each moment held for her, and only a miracle would suffice. Most of us will never live through a trauma such as this with a loved one to know and understand the impact of every moment of waiting in the unknown. As machines whirred noisily around him and nursing staff mechanically came and went, the room must have felt like a revolving scene at hurricane speed with Richard and Paulette in an eerie standstill at its eye. Doctors were constantly monitoring for responses and reactions to stimuli with low expectations and limited progress. That is, unless Richard was in the room. When Richard would enter the room with his big personality and booming voice, Paulette's eyes would begin to move in his direction and her fingers would twitch. For her initial doctor, a pronounced atheist, this behavior was unprecedented. He called it a medical phenomenon. Richard believed it to be a miracle. Within 5 weeks, Paulette could breathe without the ventilator, and gradually she moved out of trauma into ICU. Still, the entirety of Paulette's situation remained dark. Missing a section of her skull plate on the right side of her head, her deformed face held infected and unfocused eyes, bruised and swollen, she was a horrible sight to see. During this time, Richard would cry and weep and pray to God the commitment. Lord, if it's your will, it's your will. In life or death, Richard would accept the fate that God had intended for the love of his life and best friend, Paulette. The return home. After 5 grueling weeks of slow daily improvement, Paulette's score on the Glasgow scale miraculously rose to a 9, meaning she was a viable human being. She could breathe on her own, had spontaneous eye movements, responded to voices, and experienced reflexes to stimulation. She was even able to swallow small sips of Tab, her favorite soda. Doctors decided she could move from the ICU at the Med to a nursing home facility then called the Atrium, 10 minutes away. Due to being short-staffed, however, the Atrium created a more complicated and less optimistic scenario for her recovery. Richard and Kelley now rotated in shifts with Paulette, driving round-trip 34 miles a day to make certain she was under constant care. The anticipated physical and cognitive therapy Paulette needed so badly went lacking, and so they both began to research and practice these therapies on their own with little guidance. If time moved slowly, the first 5 weeks at the Med, life at the Atrium must have felt like an eternity in the mind of Richard. Attempting to manage his job as a pastor and counselor at Bellevue Baptist became much more difficult. Exhaustion consumed him. Still, working, Kelley provided support when she could, but the difficult schedule took its toll on her as well. She began to lose weight, unable to even slow to eat between commutes from the church and her mom's side. Then came time for the frozen skull plate to be reinserted to protect Paulette's healing brain. So after 6 months, they returned to the Med once more for major brain surgery. Her skull back in place within a week, Paulette grew septic. Her blood pressure dropped to 34. Her heart rate escalated to 144. Another tracheotomy was required in order to assist with her breathing. Back on a ventilator once again, Paulette nearly died. The only alternative was to remove the plate and in the process additional brain matter that had been damaged. Stressed and in shock, the body blew up with excess fluid related to her infection. Back on machines and in the ICU, doctors put her in isolation. Only Richard was allowed to attend to her, and everyone wore protective gear akin to what we've seen in science fiction films. In recovery, Richard gave Paulette permission to go home to the Lord. "Paulette, honey, I love you. If you want to go to heaven, you go ahead. I'll be there soon. But if you want to stay here and the Lord wants you here, then whatever we have to do, we'll do." This would be the second commitment Richard made to God as they worked together to keep Paulette alive. That December 30th, Richard and Paulette celebrated their 39th wedding anniversary together at the Atrium. As Richard spoke and sang to her, she would make attempts at sounds, and he prayed one day he would once again hear her beautiful voice, the sound of her playing the piano in the living room. Her prognosis worse than before, and another brief return to the Med as she fought off pneumonia that January 2006, Paulette was eventually readmitted a month and a half later back to the Atrium. Based on their prior experience, Richard now moved in with his wife at the home and began to learn to care for her the way he would be required to for years to come. And for the next 4 months, from February to June, time stood still. Finally, exactly 1 year after her accident, Paulette's neurologist, Dr. Shelley Timmons, built a polyethylene plate to replace Paulette's own skull plate. This time, the surgery was a success, her recovery solid. Upon reevaluation, she had moved to almost a 12 on the Glasgow coma scale, meaning she exhibited only moderate brain damage. Paulette and her family celebrated. There would be an incredible amount of preparation and modification needed to accommodate Paulette's many needs, but they could go home at last. Again, thank you to everyone who has been listening in and supporting. There's one more installment that I will put on YouTube this week for your final enjoyment of this story. And I would love anyone who would want to send me feedback and let me know their thoughts about not only this story, but my presentation of it and what we're doing here at my front porch. If you'd share that with me, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great week.